Okay, hello, and thank you for tuning in. I'm gonna say something here, and I hope that we can all approach it with an open mind. I want to talk about the possibility of the county of Boundary in the state of Idaho becoming its own independent nation. What? What's that, you ask? Well, let's think about it. Boundary is the absolute most northern county in the state of Idaho. It's the only one that borders the Canadian frontier, hence the name Boundary. It's all the way up at the top of the chimney of the state of Idaho, and why would this area turn into its own independent country? Well, Boundary only has a population of, between 11 and 15,000 people. It's very difficult to get a very specific number because, statistics are always changing like that. This could be an opportunity for people to actually turn this area of Boundary County into a haven for peace, a haven for individual liberty, and people living without, this massive oversight of the monolithic government. And I'm not saying this as some sort of anarcho-capitalist movement or anarchist movement at all. No, you're definitely going to have some structures, but this is one of the areas that could be treated as almost just like a massive, giant communal area. Boundary County, is, as we mentioned, it has a population that is small enough where it can actually work in terms of sustaining itself purely independently without requiring anything from the outside. But it is also, big enough that it could actually stand as an independent country. Now, if you think that's impossible, it is not. Look at the nation of Nauru, which has, a relatively similar population. They're an island nation, and they are relatively, they're an independent nation, and, population does not equal independence. Or if you don't accept Nauru, what about Vatican City, which has, a population of between 1,800 and 2,500? Are they not an independent country? Yes, they are, the world's smallest nation. Boundary County is also someplace where it's in a very unique position, where it's in between the Canada and the United States. And I find that it's so much easier to entertain the possibility of an independent nation forming when it's on international borders. You could be like, why doesn't any county in America just turn into its own independent nation? It is possible. We mentioned Vatican City. Well, what about San Marino? That's also completely within the borders of Italy, and Lesotho is completely surrounded by the borders of South Africa. So it is possible for an independent nation to form when it's, completely surrounded by a larger nation. But I think it's going to be much more difficult to push forth in, 2018 America and on the Canadian border. It's going to be much more difficult to get that across and actually turn this into something realistic and something that could actually function. How would this survive economically? Well, with a population of between 11 and 15,000, complete subsistence agriculture and other ways to sustain yourselves independently. This would be a subsistence economy. This would be something that relies 100% on its own sources. That's the whole notion of, why wouldn't you just make the whole state of Idaho independent? Why only this one county? Well, because this small group, this population size could actually be supported totally on subsistence methods. You would not require any sort of outside support for anything. Yeah, you might not be able to import chicken in from China, but who cares? No one wants to do that anyway. We only do it because people are trying to, rip off the system, so that some billionaire can increase their wealth by a few percentage points on a computer screen. It is not an actual plan that can actually benefit the citizens. And when we're talking about citizens, how about individual liberty? How about, civil libertarianism? How about, people getting to make their own decisions without, having to answer to Washington, D.C.? You could think of this as like, an absolutely enormous commune. You could think of this as just, like a very, very large social group. And it would just be like, it wouldn't, completely eliminate all ties to the United States. No, the 21st century is about internationalism. The 21st century is about diplomacy. Look at it this way. The 1958 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between India and Nepal gives Indians freedom of movement, into the nation of Nepal and like in and out. Something like that should definitely exist with America. Americans should be allowed to come into this area. And with Canadians, there should be another agreement arranged for visa-free travel. Yes, in the independent county of Boundary, yes, Canadians should be allowed to enter visa-free, and Americans can even have freedom of movement. It's not that we don't want Americans to come into the country and to leave. It's that, we would want to be creating an extremely small government over a very small area of independent land where people could make their own decisions. People would not have to be answering to Washington's IRS. And this would be something where it's like, there would be no income tax in this nation of Boundary. There would only be any sort of sales tax that would be passed, because let's face it, income tax and sales tax are not the same thing. One is money going out and the other is money going in. One, you're taxing people, at the very least, on decisions that they make, where it's like you choose whether or not you want to buy something. When it comes to the notion of taxing income, you're taxing people before they've received the money, It's like you don't get your income tax, based on your decisions. You get it before the money has arrived into your bank account. They're taking away something from you before you ever got it, and it's like, that's why people are so opposed to taxation, whereas if you just have sort of a national sales tax for this population of, around 15,000, it's like, you're at the very least, you pay taxes based on how much you want to spend. That's why they called, that national sales tax plan the fair tax, because it's just a way to make things a little bit more fair, in the sense that, people are taxed on their decisions as opposed to the lack thereof. And, let's face it, like, I'm going to reiterate, I'm not an anarchist, and I don't think anybody who would be living up there would actually want a complete anarchist state. I think that it's more likely that we could have something that has a very limited government that is funded by a national sales tax, and also with a population of 11,000 to 15,000, somewhere in that vicinity, 15,000 at the maximum. Absolutely, everybody would be getting health care. Health care is something that is quite different for the population of this size. You want to know how you do it? You just sort of make it happen. If you think that, money cannot be printed out of air, it is an absolute mistake. And, an independent nation like Boundary County could form its own sort of healthcare plan. If you want to hear this? Everybody in the county gets a card. And this card can be used for all healthcare expenditures. I mean, you might think it's somewhat similar to the medical card in America. Yeah, but that has a whole bunch of other baggage and restrictions and, provisions and catches. No, you get a card. Any citizen gets this voucher card. And then, once this is used in the hospital gets 100% of the bill, and then there's a 20% tax that is added to that goes to the capital government of our, very small government. It just creates this cycle of funding itself. It is a voucher system. It would be a way that everybody would get, their own health care. They never have to pay for it. And, it's converted into real cash. If you think that's impossible, it's not. You just have to do it. Healthcare would be completely taken care of. And, plus, that's completely separate from the any sort of transaction tax that would be going on for, sales and goods and services. For starters, though, people wouldn't even really need that much in this subsistence economy. In this subsistence economy, people are going to be responsible for their own lands. People are going to be responsible for, their own decisions about food. People are going to be responsible for their own decisions about education. And all of that stuff really just gets decided based on the decisions that people make. Boundary County has, a sort of, it has its own sort of, perfect parameters to allow this to happen. And one of the biggest things about this is foreign policy. You could actually have, a foreign policy that would be based on diplomacy. So many people talk about solving things with diplomacy as opposed to war. Well, with a nation of this size, you could actually make that happen because if Boundary County, Idaho were to turn into its own independent nation, you're not going to be planning bombing campaigns in the Middle East. You're not going to be planning, drone strikes in Yemen, and you're not going to be planning a war with North Korea or wherever in the world you can imagine. There would be no Vietnam War with Boundary County. No, absolutely not. It just wouldn't happen. So I would hope that, other counties along the Canadian border would actually be thinking of similar things. And that's not to say that you can't have any connection at all to the Washington, D.C. government or to the government of Ottawa. It is not that. You can do things diplomatically, but you would not be sort of, tied to this massive monolithic government that would, it's really just hindering the rights of a lot of citizens in America. Not to mention surveillance. I mean, it'd be so much easier for people to protect their own privacy rights living in a nation of 15,000 at the chimney of Idaho, as opposed to, living in the continental United States that were dealing with the stuff that Edward Snowden was trying to shut down. So, once again, you're not going to be participating in any of these international wars. There'll be almost zero threats of terrorism because, once again, small geography and people are not going to be connected to any form of foreign policy. It's small territory, flat out, small population. Terrorism is just going to be absolutely eliminated. And furthermore, everyone in this place is going to be carrying a firearm. You can almost assure that. So in terms of, forming its own militia, you can actually get into the whole notion of a well-regulated militia can actually go back to something that, was intended with the United States Second Amendment. There are a lot of things that could make this possible and make this a reality. And as I mentioned, I would hope that other, counties along the Canadian border would also want to turn into independent nations. And you can totally have, some sort of interconnected governmental system. We mentioned the 1958 Treaty of Peace and Friendship. We also have similar things like the Compact of Free Association, which is a law that it gives the nations of Palau and the Marshall Islands certain connections to the American government, and Americans can live and work freely in Palau and the Marshall Islands through that law, the CFA, the Compact of Free Association. You could also have, similar diplomatic ties between a nation like Boundary that would be a very, very small, country. It would not be giving Americans the right to live and work freely in Boundary, but maybe even the contrary, that people in Boundary could work in America, but of course they wouldn't be paying taxes. Because, you don't have to pay an income tax in the nation of Boundary. Everything would be decided based on a sales tax, and only citizens of Boundary would get the healthcare program that we mentioned, the voucher program. So, that's the brief introduction into turning Boundary County, Idaho into its own independent nation. As far as I know now, it's just going to be called IBC, Independent Boundary County. No total name in progress, but that's one of the other things. You would have the citizens who are going to live in this country decide on the name. They don't necessarily have to have one person decide for everybody. You can, totally use the democratic process and hold it to a vote. IBC, Independent Boundary County. Oh, times are changing.